For the last 15 years, I've been teaching American history at private schools for the most part in Virginia and now in Massachusetts in Boston. I've done a little bit of college teaching, focused mainly in terms of my own interest in the Civil War and historical memory. And, in addition to teaching, I do a little bit of writing, writing on a blog that I've been doing for over 10 years now. It's called Civil War Memory. And various kinds of publications, popular publications like The Atlantic and Smithsonian, and currently working on 2 book projects, so that takes up a little bit of time. But trying to find different ways of engaging the general public, whether it's professional development for teachers or doing tours. I want to spend as much time as possible working with the public and sharing my passion for history and learning as much as possible. It's tough to define it because I think it means different things to different people. Certainly you can get a public or a academic degree in public history to work at a museum or a public, historic site, thinking about interpretation, how to engage the general public through different kinds of programs. I think about it a bit more broadly. I think about it more as just an interest in taking what is quite often a very private and lonely venture of reading and writing about history and trying to find ways to bring it to that general audience. And for me, obviously through teaching in the classroom and then blogging and other kinds of writing, I've tried to just sort of experiment in different ways over the last 10 or so years. The Lost Cause is a narrative that sort of emerges in the wake of defeat after 1865 in the South. And there's no playbook to the Lost Cause. There's no sort of short list of things that must be included in the Lost Cause. But essentially it boils down to a few really important points. And that is, the Confederacy was, it may have been defeated on the battlefield, but its cause remained righteous to the very end. They will also argue that slavery, in contrast to what they were saying in 1861 as being sort of the reason for secession, the need for a Confederate States of America. In 1865 or after 1865, they now move away from that because of defeat, because of emancipation, and will now argue things like states' rights. They put up their best, their best foot forward in sort of promoting Robert E. Lee and Stonewall Jackson and other Confederate officials and leaders, military leaders, as Christian warriors. That the home front was unified from the beginning to the end. There was no internal fracturing. Women remained loyal to the Confederacy, and even their own slaves remained loyal to the Confederacy from beginning to end. And this is a way, I think, for the white South to not only deal with the pain of defeat, but to begin to pick up the pieces and figure out who are we now in the wake of this great unexpected loss, and how do we put the pieces together moving forward? Yeah, no, I definitely think the language we use in thinking about monuments is crucial, especially when it comes to engaging the general public. So I think when we talk about, or when people have talked about the celebration of, say, the Confederacy or anything that's being memorialized through a monument or a statue, that has, for me at least, that has very clear political overtones. It can have very clear racial overtones. It's an attempt to, and this isn't, this happens in any number of ways, but it's an attempt to, you're revering the past. You're revering or setting aside, an individual or an event that you believe is worth remembering for a specific reason. And you're usually doing that to unite a certain group of people, and it's usually not the entire community. And so, monuments, I think it's important to keep in mind, especially in the teaching context, is that they're not so much about history as they are about a certain kind of history. They're always selective. When you're digging into them, you're uncovering stories about what the people at the time hoped to honor and celebrate. And I think now that we are so far removed, especially from, say, the Civil War, we're able to, I think, become a bit more detached. And especially in the recent 150th commemoration of the Civil War, it's definitely taken more of a commemorative or educational, I would prefer to use that word, educational sort of approach to this history and trying to understand it in its totality and trying to understand both the traditional stories that a lot of us still enjoy hearing and telling, but also some of the more troubling aspects, the more difficult questions related to slavery, racism, etc., that also need to be addressed. And you can't do that in the celebratory mode, it seems. You have to do it in a more detached way. I think the sources have to be the sources from the time in question. But it's not just having access to those sources, it's also having the broader historical knowledge to properly interpret, some of these sources. And I think, especially in the context of this ongoing debate about African Americans in the Confederacy, quite often what I find is that the sources, for example, the best example, are photographs. And there are plenty of photographs of uniformed African Americans who appear, I think, to the unknown, or just the average person. Of course they're soldiers. But once you dig into the relevant, historical background, you begin to sort of, you're able to sort of more carefully interpret what you're looking at. And quite often that is left out. I mean, that's really unfortunate. So sometimes the primary sources, the relevant ones, are left out entirely. And quite often you find that they are being used, but the people who are using them are unable to properly interpret them. And they end up using them or utilizing them for more political purposes. They almost become a form of propaganda, right? You're serving a certain agenda. And especially in the age of the internet, a lot of, especially these images, they just get passed down or passed from one website to another. And that's in large part because it's very easy to copy and paste, and it's very easy to set up your own website. And so we're at a point where everyone can be his or her own historian, but it's not clear that you want everyone being his or her own historian. I think now is a real opportune time to engage in some of these tough questions. I think we're at a really interesting moment where we're having these very public, divisive, emotional debates about how we remember the past in our public spaces. And we're constantly trying to find ways of making history relevant, right? Why do we teach this stuff? And I think we're getting a lesson in this, right? Because how we remember and commemorate the past matters not just in terms of how we see ourselves as a community, what values we hold as a community, but where we're going. And our students are the next generation, and to find ways of actually getting them engaged in these discussions, I think can be incredibly empowering. Yeah, I mean, there are a number of challenges, and opportunities. And one of the things that I'm very interested in is trying to utilize the web as effectively as possible. And I think that's because more and more of our students are going to the internet to find information. Quite often, they don't know how to properly search the internet or even assess the information they're getting. So trying to encourage just sort of basic digital media literacy, I think is really important. So that's one of the kinds of things I like to stress with teachers. I mean, there's so much information out there, especially when it comes to primary sources. So, when I went through school, it was the textbook. That was the vehicle for thinking about and learning about history. But you were essentially functioning as a sponge, right? You were absorbing that material and regurgitating it in different ways. And I think we're at a place now where we can actually access a wide range of public primary sources, different kinds of primary sources that allow, I think, teachers to emphasize their students as historians. It allows the students, I think, more and more to be their own historian, to interpret, to think of history as not simply a set of facts, but a constantly evolving thing that they can take part in, a constantly evolving discussion that they can take part in. So I think monuments are an incredibly important primary source artifact that teachers can engage their students with. And I think the reason they can be so effective is because I can only think of a few other ways where you can actually focus students on how history plays out around them, right? And so it's a way of actually connecting students to their own communities. And when you teach them how to interpret monuments, you're teaching your students actually how to think historically about their own community. You're engaging them, and quite often you find students who end up taking part in whether it's an ongoing debate about monuments. One of my former students in Charlottesville is now leading an effort to protect one of the monuments that has come under scrutiny, in the city in recent months. And well, I think the first thing teachers have to do in sort of prepping for any kind of field trip is they themselves have to know the history. I mean, the teacher has to be comfortable interpreting not just the history of the monument, but I also think thinking through some of the questions that they want their students to think about. Because these, especially when we're dealing with Confederate monuments right now, these can easily turn into very divisive debates, even in a classroom context. And so I think teachers need to think through that, and I think they need to think carefully about the kinds of questions they want their students to think about. What's the object of the trip itself? What does the teacher hope his or her students will get out of it? I think especially when it comes to some of these divisive topics, I think this is especially true for public school teachers. I mean, my career has been in private schools. I had a lot of freedom in the classroom, and I didn't have to answer to the kinds of constituents that public school teachers do. And I think, especially at a time when your best intentions can be interpreted in any number of ways, I think it's important to make sure that you have the right relationship, that you're informing the administration about what you're doing. You may even want to take the opportunity to inform parents about what you're doing. Because I think I've seen a number of stories in the papers where, especially when it comes to teaching slavery, teachers have made, I think, really bad moves in the classroom, and even their best moves have resulted in terminations. But the other thing I think is really important is that if you're going to engage in some of these topics in the classroom, you better understand the material. You have to be very, I think, comfortable and competent with the history itself, so that when you are pressed on certain things, especially when it comes to mythology, that you're able to respond, that you're able to sort of present yourself as the authority that you hope to be seen as, right? You're the history teacher. You studied this stuff, and you're trying to find creative and helpful ways for your students to do so as well, to understand this material. And you yourself better know it.